So I wanted to take the opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing in Nepal since 2015 about post-earthquake recovery and reconstruction, and also to think explicitly about how some of the experiences there might yield some interesting starting points for thinking about shared contexts in BC. And I wanted to also give you a little bit of insight into the SSHRC Partnership Development Grant that I was PI on, which under which much of this work took place, but also if I have time to talk a little bit about my own longstanding ethnographic work. We'll see. I've been working in Nepal as an anthropologist for over 25 years and got involved in disaster-related research after the 2015 earthquakes there. So I hope part of what you might take away from this talk is what it might look like to have that kind of long-standing research engagement and then be following a kind of disaster recovery process over the long term, rather than coming in to a place with the already existing intention to study disaster after it happens. So that's a slightly different starting point that I have. And I also want to share a little bit about some of the principles for collaboration, which guided this project. And I hope that also might just open up some conversation around how we might think on comparable wavelengths within this network here too. So I use a lot of photography in my ethnographic work. A lot of the images come from places that I've been, communities that I've been working with for a long time period, and the images are used with consent. This starting image is actually of the house, so to speak, that I've lived in during my time in Dholaka, Nepal, since the late 1990s. As you see here, this is the house under Reconstruction after the earthquake, and our host is in the foreground. He sadly passed away in June 2021 from COVID, and so much of the work that I'm doing now, the ethnographic writing that I'm now, is dedicated to his memory. And that was also one of the very difficult things about this scenario, is that people in Nepal had experienced a conflict, then a major civil conflict, then an earthquake, and then COVID, really in rapid succession. So there's a larger story about cascading crises, which is part of what I'm writing about in my own kind of book-length ethnography that I'm working on these themes. Oh, let me get rid of that. There's a message up here. Got it. Great. Okay, so this just gives you a bit of a view of what actually happened. Nepal experienced two major earthquakes in April and May 2015. And this was from the UN Office for the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs just a couple of months after that, in August 2015. What it shows you are the two epicenters. The first earthquake was epicentered in Gorkha district, further to the west, that large yellow dot. And the second one in May 2015 was epicentered in Dholaka district, the yellow dot to the east. And that's where my research has been based since the late 1990s. So the people whom I work with were directly affected, and nearly everything was rendered unusable very quickly. The earthquake occurred just at a time that Nepal was going through a protracted political transition, and that is actually what the focus of my work had been on at the time that the earthquakes occurred. So for me, a lot of the sort of analytical framing of the post-earthquake work has been understanding that in relation to political transformation. So really seeing the natural disaster of the earthquake as one process of transformation, and its ensuing reconstruction as one process of transformation that's occurred in tandem with a process of post-conflict state restructuring. And so it's been critical from my point of view to understand how these two processes have influenced each other. And in this slide, you can see also this timeline here where the process of post-conflict state restructuring also entailed administrative transformation, where all of the administrative boundaries of the country were changed. in 2017, and this was in a process that was already ongoing, that those new boundaries were legislated by a 2015 constitution that was promulgated just a couple of months after the earthquakes occurred. And there's much more we could say about how the earthquakes actually shaped the political process. Is not the focus of my research here, but there's been quite a lot written about that by now. So then after 2015, the process of post-disaster reconstruction began. And part of the point that I've been trying to make in my larger work on this is that these twin processes are very entangled, but they also have similar sorts of ideological and conceptual underpinnings. In Nepali, the term for post-conflict state restructuring is punar samrachana, and in post-disaster reconstruction, it's punar nirman. And both of these ideas of restructuring and reconstruction have this concept of redoing something, like starting something new from a kind of particular point in time and having an opportunity to rethink what it is you want those structures to be. So I've been thinking about how people really imagine the ideal structures that they want to live in, both in terms of the state structure, when you have an opportunity to completely redo things and remake your boundaries, also remake your systems of governance, but you also at the same time have an opportunity to remake your built environment due to a natural disaster. So that's been the really interesting kind of confluence in Nepal's experience. In order to address these issues, I got together with a group of colleagues and applied for funding from SSHRC, which we held from 2017 to 2022. It was originally a 3-year project, but it got extended for 2 years due to COVID, which turned out to be very helpful because it was impossible to do a lot of things during that period. And the title of the grant was Expertise, Labor, and Mobility in Nepal's Post-Conflict, Post-Disaster Reconstruction, Construction, Finance, and Law as Domains of Social Transformation. And I will never apply for a grant with a title that long again. I learned a lesson. But it did define quite well what we were trying to do, and it also flagged this kind of intersection of post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction, and really reconstruction as something which has both of those elements. People often do write about peace building as reconstruction, as well as the way it's talked about reconstruction in the post-disaster context. So it was a 20+ in the end member partnership team with institutional partnerships in Nepal, as well as here in Canada, Denmark, and the US, and also several Canadian student participants who worked on various elements of the project, grad and undergrad, and community organizations, both here in Canada, as well as in Nepal. It was a transdisciplinary team from several disciplines, and here you can see some of the spread. And for me, this was the first time I'd managed anything this complex, and it really was an incredible learning experience, but also quite challenging, both in terms of the kind of logistics, of international work on a theme like this, but also in terms of the transdisciplinary formation, working with different kinds of priorities and academic working styles. And I think our network here shares some of that, and it feels a little bit more familiar to me this time around than it did starting in on this project. Great. Can you see that online?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Not so difficult then. Okay, so most of our material is archived here, and I can share the link if people would like later. But you can find quite a lot about the work that we did. I'm going to go to the publications page because that gives me the overview of the scope of the work, and then I'm going to talk about some of the publications in more detail as a way into the kind of main themes and research findings. So in this project, we had a commitment from the beginning to produce a variety of outputs. The main partner organization we work with in Nepal, Social Science Baha, is an academic NGO. We also had affiliation with the university, Central Department of Anthropology, but for various political reasons, it's actually much easier to work with an academic NGO than with the university, and that was actually at the university department's request as well. So for the academic NGO, they work on a variety of policy issues, and it was critical for them that we were publishing work that was accessible in the public domain and for a policy audience. That's also important to me. And they also wanted to publish a series of working papers, which would enable the Nepal-based researchers. Over time, we had 4 researchers working on the project who were master's graduates And for them, it was really important to have a place where they could publish their own empirical work without necessarily having to go through the academic journal review process, and really being able to make the information relevant to a local audience. So we had those commitments from the start. We also wanted to publish op-eds in locally based newspapers to generate some greater public exposure. And then, of course, we did want to publish journal articles and book chapters, but having that overall publication strategy was complicated because we had to work with who was co-authoring what, who was leading on what kinds of outputs, and also trying to work out the relationship between how we were using data in different kinds of outputs and the timing and so forth. But we did end up putting out a series of 4 policy briefs. I won't go into detail here, but these were circulated amongst both governmental and non-governmental actors in Nepal and within the international community supporting the recovery process. And the working papers as well, which focus on, our research was conducted in 3 different districts of Nepal, which all had different specific contexts. And so these working papers also allowed kind of deep dives into the district specific context, which would have been too much material to publish in a single academic article. And then we had an op-ed in the Kathmandu Post, which is one of the major English language dailies, as well as a piece in The Conversation, which people may be familiar with here. It's a Canadian-based forum for public scholarship. And then so far we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 published journal articles, all of which are co-authored across different members of the team. And there are 2 more in press, which I'll talk about in a moment. Also, we had the opportunity to publish 1 book chapter in a volume called Epicenter to Aftermath, Rebuilding and Remembering in the Wake of Nepal's Earthquakes, which is a kind of edited volume that brings together different disciplinary perspectives to think about that theme. So that's kind of the full scope of the work. Okay, there's something in the chat. Okay, thank you for sharing the link. So I'm now going to go back to my slides, and what I want to do is just talk through the key arguments of each of the academic pieces that we have published, and then share some of my thoughts about their lessons learned and applications in the context we're in here. So the first article that came out was co-authored by myself and 2 Nepali Canadian colleagues based here. Ratna Shrestha teaches in Vancouver School of Economics here at UBC, and Ramji Padajuli is a political scientist at Capilano University. And we actually had known each other previously, but got to know each other a lot better very quickly soon after the earthquakes, as community organizations sought partnerships for raising funds and supporting people in need. And I got involved with some of those efforts. And the 3 of us worked on some of those projects together. And then after the fact, we realized that we were observing some very interesting dynamics taking shape. And we decided to write an article looking at how the community, the Nepali Canadian diasporic community here, was affected by their experience of disaster response. And this was published in the journal BC Studies, which is based here at UBC. And covers themes in VC studies. And it was one of the first articles published anywhere about Nepali Canadians as a distinctive community. There's a little bit of work about Nepali Canadians in the Greater Toronto area, but nothing about them in BC. So this was a project which was relevant to the community here, and felt like a kind of interesting and important way to contribute to their broader goals, also of gaining visibility as a population here, in addition to sharing thoughts about what it meant for informal diasporic networks to be engaged in disaster response. And the image here is in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery. This is just a couple of days after the first April 15th earthquake, where people gathered for a vigil here. And so the main arguments of the piece really are that informal networks and volunteer efforts are critical in disaster response, and in this particular case, diasporic networks. and that responding to disaster also creates opportunities for community building among those who are involved, in this case, leading to more visibility and political recognition for the Nepali Canadian community. So one of the big points that we wanted to make is that it's not all just one way, that it's people in a diasporic or sort of more privileged community who are sharing resources with a home community in a place like Nepal that's suffering from disaster. But the process of doing that itself also leads to opportunities for community building for the people on the mobilizing end. And so that's a main argument of the piece, as well as really making the point that these diasporic networks were critical, especially in the early phases of post-earthquake response in Nepal. So some of the lessons that I think are relevant in the BC context have to do with the role of community-based organizations. We saw similar dynamics here after the 2021 extreme weather events, where first responders were often from community-based organizations on a volunteer basis. And I especially noted the role of Sikh Gurudwaras, both based here in Vancouver, but all across the Lower Mainland, who are in the habit of, as part of their religious practice, offering large-scale free meals to community members. So they were able to mobilize quickly and take that on the road, and they were delivering food to communities in need, in Merritt and Hope, Lytton, and so forth. So I think looking at those kinds of relationships and the type of community-based organizations here, which might be ready to mobilize in disaster in advance, could be useful. And preparedness planning and consultation and collaboration with those existing structures, particularly for those serving vulnerable, marginalized, and racialized communities, might help deliver more efficient responses when the time comes in the case of the various disasters that we're facing here. Okay, so moving on to the second piece, and I just wanted to give really brief overviews of each of these and then let you take up whatever you're interested in Q&A, and hopefully it all kind of comes together a bit. The second piece was published in Development and Change, which is a development studies journal that people might be familiar with, and focuses on the theme of disaster financialization. And this one was led by our colleague Philippe Lebillon, who's part of this network. I think he's on leave this year, which is why we have not seen him, but he's cross-appointed in geography and School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And he was joined by several other colleagues in authoring the paper. So in this paper, we were looking at contrasting experiences across the 3 different earthquake-affected districts where we conducted most of our fieldwork to propose the concept of disaster financialization as a term through which to understand the simultaneous acceleration of monetization, leveraging of cash incentives by donors and government to build back better, and the flurry of financial transactions associated with the reconstruction processes. And in part, this is not in the bit I put up here, this is kind of in contrast to the concept of disaster capitalism, which people may be familiar with from our colleague in geography, Naomi Klein, where the notion is that capital is this juggernaut which moves into post-disaster contexts. And while in many cases that may be true, what we were observing in Nepal was much more variegated than that. And we wanted to kind of push back against the idea that new experiences of financialization were always negative. Although we observed several negative effects, we also observed positive ones where people in a primarily rural and agrarian context who had not previously had access to various kinds of financial institutions were on the one hand enrolled in them, which could be seen as a negative experience, but also were given opportunities to engage with new forms of finance, and in some cases able to secure loans or other kinds of financial instruments, which were helpful not only in the reconstruction process, but also in further processes of defining new livelihoods. So we were trying to kind of nuance the discussion around how capital and finance works in reconstruction processes. And kind of make the argument that it may have some silver linings if the implications are considered in pre-disaster planning processes. So I think here in BC, thinking forward with this, and of course, in many ways it's a different context in terms of like socioeconomic conditions, but in many ways there are also similarities. And I would suggest that it's important to ensure that reconstruction programs take into account in general, the broader political economic context. And I mean, that sounds really basic, but one of the things that we observed in Nepal, and this argument has also been made in various other post-disaster contexts, is that that's just not really done in a significant way. Often best practices for reconstruction are circulated from one area to another, and in part, that's some of what I'm suggesting we should be doing. On the other hand, it's really critical to understand local contexts and specificities and to kind of have a balance of those two approaches. So in BC, that broader political economic context might include, for instance, the housing crisis, overall inflation that affects the costs of reconstruction, and ongoing broader infrastructural developments, things like the Broadway Plan or other kinds of large-scale infrastructural development, long-term broad infrastructural development plans. So an owner-driven reconstruction program, which is what the Nepal reconstruction program was, where people were given subsidies to rebuild their own houses, may price people out of their neighborhood if reconstruction subsidies are too low and or if the opportunity costs of accessing them are too high. And that's part of what happened in Nepal, that people received a one-size-fits-all grant to rebuild their house, but often they had to go to a bank they'd never been to before in a faraway city to access it. And in many cases, people just decided this is too complicated, I'm not going to do it. Or they were unable to rebuild where they owned land because the costs of construction, for instance, were too high. So thinking about the kind of financial framework that these kinds of programs are rolled out in is important. And I'm not an economist, and this was a lot of learning for me too in this process, but I can see, broadly the need for analysis in this domain. And so those are some of the risks with an owner-driven program. With top-down programs where housing is being constructed by the state or by state contracted developers, you can end up with situations that benefit primarily those corporations or the developers and create opportunities to expand existing infrastructural plans without specific attention to citizens' post-disaster needs. So those are some of the things to be considering in advance, how these kinds of processes might dovetail with agendas that are already existing and what kind of spaces the disaster might open up for them, positively or negatively. Oh, and the image on this slide, this is again my host in Dolika, whom I spoke of at the beginning, and his wife, our hostess, and they are holding in front of their temporary shelter. This is in 2016, I believe, before they had reconstructed. They're holding both their agreement papers that they had to sign with the government in order to receive their $3,000 flat reconstruction subsidy, as well as the checkbook that they were issued to access those funds from the bank. And for this family, like many, it was the first time that they were engaged in these kind of formal banking processes. Okay, so moving on to another piece. This is a paper that kind of was not conceptualized at the beginning of the project, but emerged in process. It's a methods paper about how collaboration works in these kinds of complex arrangements. It was led by grad students who were part of the project. They started to observe certain dynamics that they found troubling and very bravely and commendably brought those issues to me as the PI. This occurred during a joint field trip that we had in 2018 in the summer in Nepal. And it led to a really just enriching and rewarding set of conversations about what it felt like to be part of this behemoth of a project from all of these different positionalities, and led us to really think through some of the power dynamics that were sort of implicit, unspoken, but led to different kinds of experiences and outcomes. And I did participate in writing this paper, as did Catherine Rankin, who was another co-investigator. And through the process of writing the paper itself, we also had an opportunity to talk further across our different experiences. And so part of this paper is kind of more generally about dynamics of collaboration, particularly in complex international projects, but part of it is about the specifics of the ethics of collaboration across power dynamics in disaster research contexts, where many of the people with whom we may be working are in situations where they're not necessarily able to exercise full agency or to step out. One of the things that several of the Nepali colleagues who are writing in this piece noted is that there was a significant amount of research fatigue in the areas where we were working, that many researchers had come into this context right after the disaster and were asking similar kinds of questions at a level that people just were tired of by a certain point, and that it was really necessary to go deeper than that, to build on long-term existing collaborations and or to forge new ones, but that were not just opportunistic and short-term. And so those are some of the things that I think might be worth thinking about here. So, I mean, I think the lessons, and these are lessons that might be interested in considering within this network as well, are that collaboration across disciplines, social locations, and career stage, even amongst scholars, such as ourselves, let alone with community partners, this is always a process fraught with power imbalances. And acknowledging these dynamics openly and critically engaging with them at the outset of any research collaboration and continuously through the process is really important. And in BC, such considerations may be especially important when working with Indigenous communities, but also with government partners and even within our own networks. So just kind of a pause there to reflect upon that and how we might want to integrate some of that thinking. And the image that I've put up here this is actually from my most recent trip to Nepal, which is with a different research project, which has grown out of the one I'm describing here, but with the same research institute. And here we're conducting a focus group discussion about post-earthquake resettlement. So I'm working with Nepali colleagues. I was taking the picture, so I'm not in it, but you see some of my colleagues facilitating the discussion along with community partners. So, but really thinking about that sitting in a circle and what it means to have these kinds of ideas bouncing back and forth across a group of people like that. And then finally, this is a piece, or not finally in terms of published pieces, and I'm still going to talk about the two more that are in process. This piece just was published about a week ago, and this was led by the same colleague who was involved with the first piece that I mentioned, Ratna Shrestha. It's in what is actually an econ journal. It's called the Journal of Happiness Studies. And it looks at different kinds of metrics and indicators for happiness and well-being in global contexts. And this paper was based upon a 400 household survey, which Ratna led, and it was the most quantitative piece of the research that we did. As you've seen, most of the rest of the work has been based on ethnographic work, but this one was based on a quantitative survey, which asked people about how satisfied they were with their reconstructed home. And the interviews were conducted in 2018 and 19 in locations where the reconstruction process had been declared more or less complete by the government. And so we were able to ask people what that process was like and what parts of it they were satisfied with and not satisfied with. And the results, in a way, give a quantitative evidence base to what we had already been able to say qualitatively sometime earlier than that in the working papers, which is that the owner-driven program that was introduced in Nepal, although in a way it gave people a certain amount of freedom because they were expected to rebuild their own home. On the other hand, it had many constraints and was defined too narrowly, so that people did not feel that they had adequate choice in how they were actually reconstructing their structure in which they were going to be living. I talked about some of the financial challenges in relation to the earlier paper, but this paper deals more with some of the construction and material challenges. And the images that I have up here, the image that I have up here is one of the posters that was put up in village contexts, showing people what the accepted building techniques were. And the intention here was, of course, to introduce more earthquake resilient building design for the future, which is very much a good idea and universally agreed upon as how reconstruction should proceed. Yet there were very narrow constraints placed on the way that this was to be implemented, and homeowners who had previously always built their own homes, and this is in a kind of rural context where people build their own homes with local materials, they actually had to bring in trained carpenters and masons, and they had to have certain kinds of certifications, and there were only 17 approved designs of the kind of houses that could be built. And in actuality, even though there were 17 approved designs, in most cases, the communication did not work well. So people really only thought there were one or two choices. So many people ended up building structures which did not serve them well. Sometimes only one room for families who had previously had 4 or 6 rooms. In other cases, without certain kinds of space, say for livestock or other kinds of critical elements of their livelihood, because the program was so constrained. So the lessons from this paper, and this was borne out by people's responses in the surveys, were that people were would be much more satisfied with a program that would offer more freedom of choice. And even many people who did receive the full subsidy and were kind of seen as being in a fortunate category of having been able to reconstruct their house fully, had limited satisfaction with the resultant product. So, I mean, I think these lead to some of the questions that we might consider here too, and ask what kinds of policies might BC put in place to enforce earthquake resilient building codes in the wake of disaster, while at the same time ensuring that homeowners are able to exercise an appropriate level of choice in construction. And these questions are also relevant, of course, for people whose homes are damaged by other kinds of disasters, such as floods or fires as well, although often in those kinds of cases, the experience is different, because one of the things that's unique to a reconstruction program after an extreme event like an earthquake is that it's operating at mass scale and needing to enroll, in this case, ultimately almost 1 million households overall. And that might be different, say, than in a seasonal event where you have smaller numbers of people who are affected, and there may be more flexibility in the ways that some of these policies are rolled out. So moving on, this is the paper that is most anthropological, and I'm the lead author on this one, and it is forthcoming in Current Anthropology. It's one of those academic sob stories where it was accepted actually 2 years ago to the week, and it's still not out. So that's a source of some consternation for me. One of the reasons is that Current Anthropology has commentaries authored. So your article is accepted, and then they solicit, I think it's 8 to 10 commentaries from other scholars, which are published simultaneously at the same time, but still it's a very long lag time. In any case, in this piece, we're really making an argument about the terms house and household in particular, and how those terms are deployed in policy contexts for planning post-disaster reconstruction. And we argue that house, household, and home are key sites of regulation for the state, as well as for the development and humanitarian organizations that work within it. And what we saw in the post-earthquake reconstruction process in Nepal were the conceptual limitations in existing legal definitions of ownership and residence, and the way that these were deployed to determine who would be eligible for reconstruction subsidies led to real challenges in people's sense of belonging at the effective level. And part of this had to do with conditions of high mobility, meaning that people move a lot for seasonal labor. But for instance, if they didn't happen to be at home on the day that the survey was carried out to determine eligibility for reconstruction subsidy, they might not have made it onto the list. So that's just a very simple example of how mobility can be a challenge in defining the definition of household. Sorry, I should say that if the head of household, the person registered as head of household wasn't present, they would have trouble getting on that list. So even if a wife or child or somebody else was there, that could be problematic. So that brings up questions around kinship and ownership and how you define this for purposes of reconstruction programs. One of the other big issues, and that's what this image shows here, is that in many cases, Property ownership is complex, so that you might have one piece of property which is actually housing three separate houses. That's what you see here in an urban environment, owned in this case by three brothers. But for the purposes of allocating Reconstruction subsidies, that was only recognized as one household because there was only one land title deed. So functionally, you had three households that were operating separately financially and as separate nuclear families, but they could only access the flat $3,000 grant because of the way their ownership was registered. In a lot of rural areas, you saw the opposite, where you might actually have rather than the kind of one piece of property, you might actually have several structures distributed over much more open space. But if the household was only registered and linked to, say, one material structure, there was no chance of accessing grants for the other structures. So in that case, you have a piece of property, but where people have sort of proliferated upon it, but it's also not possible. It was also very complicated for people to get what they needed. So lessons here are that we may want to look at how key concepts such as house and household are defined in BC's disaster-related policies. What might happen to a household that lives in an illegal suite in a house owned by a non-resident landlord, for instance, at the time of a disaster? What assumptions about kinship and residence are at work in the ways that disaster preparedness and response are envisioned? There are some interesting examples that point in this direction from COVID-related policy, which is something that I became very interested in as we were writing this paper, finalizing this paper, and COVID was ongoing in the way that, as you might remember, during lockdowns, there were certain prohibitions about mingling with other households. And a lot of questions were raised about, well, what does that actually mean? What about multi-generational families? And there were many examples of this, particularly from certain cultural communities where it's very normal to live with multiple generations in the household, and people were being stigmatized for having those kinds of interactions in the COVID context. Also blended families with divorce or remarriage, etc. So when we're thinking about these kinds of kinship questions in the context of disaster, how would we ensure equity and post-disaster resource allocation given these kinds of diversities of household setup and the ways that household is often not coterminous with house? And I mean, that's really the simplest way to put the argument of this paper, that there's an assumption in many of the policy documents that govern Reconstruction in Nepal, as well as in many other global contexts, that those two things always equal one another, but the reality is much more complicated. Okay, and this is the final piece that I wanted to talk about in brief, and this is a paper that's still under review with colleagues in art history and material culture studies. It's at the Journal of Material Culture, and it's about heritage reconstruction and the politics of identity. And this is the one place in which we really look at Nepal's cultural heritage and how that was managed in the wake of the disaster. We worked in the city of Bhaktapur, which is, as a city, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a very beautiful location with all kinds of temples and other kinds of heritage structures. But what happened was a sort of really deep set of contestations around what counted as heritage for the purposes of Reconstruction. So in the example of this particular temple that you see in the image, it was actually several hundred years old, but had been destroyed in a previous earthquake in 1934 and rebuilt in a very different style, which suited the country's rulers at the time, but wasn't actually true to the kind of indigenous cultural heritage of that region. So in the wake of the 2015 earthquakes, this argument erupted around, well, how do you rebuild? Do you rebuild as it was at the time of the 2015 earthquake, which was actually only built in 1934 and was a real issue of contestation and dissatisfaction by many indigenous community members until it was destroyed in 2015? Or do you rebuild in the style that's well documented in paintings, for instance, from colonial collections and so forth that existed until 1934? And that's just one of a couple of case studies that we talk about in this paper, looking at how disaster opens up this space to reconsider values around heritage in the past and cultural identity. This is something that Jonathan actually knows a lot more about than I do in terms of these kinds of conversations in BC. So maybe he can chime in if we have more questions or discussion around this. But in short, heritage is a contested domain in BC as well. And there are often competing values at stake in a debate that is often framed around resilience, safety, and functionality in opposition to heritage or aesthetics or cultural value. And there are examples I could talk about from the school seismic mitigation program, which is one of the things I've been working on here over time, as well as the Lytton post-wildfire reconstruction, where archaeological heritage in the area has become a critical issue in terms of reconstruction timelines, but also questions about who will rebuild and how. So much more that could be said about that as well. I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I've given you a kind of rapid tour through all of the different elements of the work that we have been conducting in Nepal. There still may be a few bits and pieces coming out, but largely this project is over. And I'm now involved in a kind of follow-on project, which is about landsliding in Nepal. So it has many similar considerations, but it's really looking at landsliding as a regular seasonal occurrence rather than the extreme event of the earthquake. But much of the learning around the themes that I've shared with you here are relevant there too. And I'm also looking forward to being able to take up some of the ideas that come out of this work, hopefully in future research here in BC. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to talk about whatever elements of this might be most interesting to you.